All right, welcome back to World History Unit 5, and this is Video 5. All right, we are still in Rome, and last time we left off with the tribal assembly gaining the power to pass laws that were binding upon all the people of Rome, both plebeians, the poor, and the patricians, the wealthy. But we start to see that distinction develop, rich versus poor. So, with that in mind, let's get into Rome, the master of the Western Mediterranean. So, Rome's conquests of the Italian peninsula brought it into conflict with Carthage, which was the other big power of the ancient world. Locate it's Carthage is located in North Africa and it possessed a lot of good harbors, it had a lot of good mining resources, and it was known for its navy in the Western Mediterranean. While Phoenicia, which was the mother country of Carthage, grew weak as a result of the Assyrians and the Chaldeans' conquests there, Carthage kind of separated off unto itself and built an empire in the west that included the North African coast, southern Spain, the islands of Sardinia and Corsica, and also parts of the island of Sicily. So between 264 and 146 BC, Rome and Carthage fought each other in three wars. So both cities controlled much territory in the Western Mediterranean. Both were expanding rapidly. And in addition to those two things, Rome and Carthage were competing for control of trade in the Mediterranean. And this rivalry just built with every war, and it built jealousy and fear. And it was a really grueling war. Now, these wars are called the Punic Wars. And my suggestion to you is to hook one fact with each war so that you can keep them straight. All right. So let's get into the First Punic War. This is from 264 to 241 BC, so it's pretty lengthy. The First Punic War was fought over the control of the island of Sicily. The Romans feared that Carth I sometimes struggle with the name, bear with me. The Carthaginians would become too strong on the island. So a powerful rival force could control the waters between Sicily and Italy, and if that was the case, if Carthage did that, that would hinder Roman trade in the Mediterranean. So Sicily is where this is taking place, and that's the rock that the Italian boot is kicking. Um, They also thought if Carthage owned all of Sicily, they would also have a very strategic military base to attack the rest of Italy through southern Italy. So the only way Rome could stop Carthage was to break its naval supremacy. So Roman sailors could not match the experience and the skill of the Carthagins. So Rome developed new tactics for fighting at sea. So up until this time, naval battles were won by ramming and sinking enemy vessels. But Rome substituted soldiers for experienced sailors. And when an enemy ship came near, a plank was dropped, like a drawbridge, so that its spiked tip fastened to the deck of the enemy's army ship. And then the armed Roman soldiers would swarm and, swing across ropes onto the enemy boat and capture the ship. So by this method, Rome crippled the navy of Carthage, and Carthage sued for peace in 241 BC. And the terms of the settlement included Roman control of Sicily and the requirement for Carthage to pay for Roman losses. So we're fighting over Sicily, and the Romans won the First Punic War. And they developed a new way to war at sea, and we see pirates use that later on in history. Now we're moving on to the Second Punic War. All right. Carthage recovered from its defeat in the First Punic War. Now we're moving on. So the first one was up to through 241. Then we have some years of peace. And then in 218 to 201 BC, we see the Second Punic War. So Carthage recovers from its defeat from the first one and extends its control over much of Spain now. They're like, so if we can't have Sicily, let's go the other direction, Spain. And in 219 BC, Carthage attacked a Roman ally, not the ally, as it was a Spanish town on the Mediterranean coast, and the city fell after an 8-month siege. And the Second War broke out between Carthage and Rome. Rome, which did have now the superior navy, they planned to isolate Carthage's forces in Spain by sending one army to Spain and another to Carthage. So Rome was really hoping that this could be a really quick war. Basically, divide and conquer was the plan here. Um, and this strategy might have worked if it had not been for a young Carthaginian commander named Hannibal. That is a name you need to know. Hannibal is a young Carthage commander. And historians have likened Hannibal to Alexander the Great. He had very effective leadership and tactical skills, and he won the devotion of his soldiers. Like they were like Hannibal soldier for life type mindset. So he was known as a military genius. They still study Hannibal's uh, war strategies at West Point and other military colleges. So this military genius devised strategies that are still being studied. And in this one, what he's going to use against the Romans, Hannibal believed that his only hope of success was to invade Italy and capture Rome. So by invading Italy, he planned to present himself as a liberator to Rome's conquered allies and give them an opportunity to break with Rome and gain their freedom. So he realized that if he didn't have the supplies nor the manpower to get Rome, but if he got all the people who had been wronged by Rome on his side, then he could do something. That's clever. Without the soldiers and resources that were supplied by all of the conquered people, Rome could be conquered. Now that was so Hannibal thought. That was his idea, and it was a brilliant idea. Now, he has a cavalry with about 40,000 men, and they have elephants too. Remember, they're coming from northern Africa. Um, so Hannibal sets out from Spain. He marches his army over the rugged, snow-covered Alps and into northern Italy. And the dangerous mountain passes and wintry weather and attacks from the mountain tribes all combined to cut his army by half and left him with only a few supplies and a few elephants. So, nevertheless, he still takes, after taking these elephants off, through the slippery mountains and the cold, they end up right outside Rome. And he surprised the Romans because they believed it was impossible for an entire army to cross the Alps during the winter. And during the next 15 years, Hannibal brilliantly led his outnumbered army to many victories in Italy. And in the spring of 2016 BC, the Romans suffered one of the worst defeats in their long history at Cannae. It's spelled Cannae. It was a small town southeast of Rome, and the Roman legions confronted Hannibal's army because the Romans outnumbered his army almost 2-1. Hannibal, though, he's all about being clever. He had superior battle tactics. He arranged his forces in the same fashion as the Roman troops, like cavalry units. But unlike the Roman line, Hannibal's line bulged forward at the center, inviting the Romans to attack there. So he was controlling where they were going to go. The Roman infantry charged the center of Hannibal's line, hoping to break it and divide Carthage's forces. While the outside of Hannibal's line held its ground, the center, according to plan, retreated, drawing and advancing the Romans into a U-shaped pocket. And the Romans found themselves hemmed in by the enemy on three sides. Meanwhile, Hannibal's cavalry, which had gotten Rome's cavalry already, circled around and attacked the rear, like the top of the U, and totally surrounded the Roman army, and they almost completely wiped them out. Hannibal may have lost around 6,000 men, but the Romans probably lost around 60,000 men. A generation passed before Rome recovered from this terrible defeat. So in the Second Punic War, we are introduced to Hannibal. He surprises the Romans and Carthage wins. Okay, Carthage wins. Now this is going to put Rome in its spot for quite some time. Um, so to make matters worse, Rome had to contend with a new Carthage ally, Macedonia, and suppress Syracuse, a powerful Greek city on Sicily that had revolted against Rome. So there's a lot of internal problems happening here. Despite these advantages, Hannibal was unable to conquer the city of Rome after his big defeat. He lacked the heavy siege equipment that they needed to break down the Roman walls. So furthermore, he gained only a few people. That was where his assessment was wrong. He thought all these people would not want to be under Roman control. There was only a few recruits from the people he freed from Roman rule. So the reason why that is because Rome's fair and generous treatment of its subjects actually encouraged them to remain loyal. So the turning point in this war came through the daring strategy of a young Roman commander named Scipio. So Scipio is a member of a powerful family. He became the most famous Roman of all of his time, like all time there. He's a superstar. And after defeating the Carthaginian forces in Spain, he could have moved his army into Italy to take on Hannibal. That would have been like the predictable thing to do. But instead, he crossed over to northern Africa and prepared to attack Carthage. Hannibal, at this point, he's not lost a battle in Italy for years. He's ordered back home to defend Carthage. But by the time he arrives, it's too late, and not even the leadership of Hannibal could stop Scipio and the Roman legions. And at the Battle of Zama, Zama, in 202 BC, the Romans defeated the Carthaginian army, and Carthage surrendered and was forced to give up all of its territory outside of North Africa, reduced its fleet to only 10 vessels, and pay a great sum of Rome for war damages. Rome was now the master of the Western Mediterranean world. So, there is a huge win for Carthage at the beginning of the Second Punic War, but yet again, in the end, years later, we see that Rome smashes Carthage. And you might think, like, hey, this sounds like it's all wrapped up and done. That's what one would think. But we have one more war 50 years later. The Third Punic War is from 149 to 146 BC, so it's much shorter. It's 50 years after the second one. Carthage broke one of the provisions with its treaty to Rome. And in response, Rome harshly demanded that the Carthaginians move their city 10 miles inland. Now, think about just the authority you have to tell a city to move away from, move 10 miles inland, not be next to the coast. Like, you have to have so much authority to move a whole city just because someone broke terms of provision. That's how powerful the Romans were. Now, since such a move would mean the death of their commercial center, the citizens of Carthage decided to fight instead. But the Carth but the citizens of Carthage were no match for the Romans. After a 3-year siege, the Romans captured the city and destroyed it. They sold the surviving inhabitants into slavery and turned um, the land around Carthage into a new Roman province called Africa. And that is where the name for the African co- continent comes from. Whoa, it came from the Romans after they defeated Carthage. So after the Third Punic War, Rome turned its attention to the eastern portion of the Mediterranean. And there was the kingdoms carved out by Alexander the Great, Macedonia, Syria, Egypt. And they started to engage in power struggles with each one of these empires. Now, because Macedonia had joined Carthage against Rome during the Second Punic War, Rome sent its legions to deal with Macedonia first, right after the Carthage defeat. And Macedonia was pretty weakened by then, and um, and then so they so they're pretty weak. And then the king of Syria marched into Asia Minor and crossed the Hellespont and invaded the kingdom of Macedonia. Rome met his challenge by defeating it. So basically, Rome gets all of them. Macedonia, Syria, and then Egypt as well. So he gets all three. Now, Egypt kind of saw the writing on the wall, and so they actually made an alliance with Rome at the time because they didn't want the defeat. But with this completed, Rome became the master of the entire Mediterranean world. And the prophet Daniel's visions were fulfilled as the kingdoms of Alexander's generals fell into the Roman Empire. And if you look at Daniel 2, and then Daniel 7, verses 6 through 7, and then Daniel 8, verses 8, we see the Daniel prophesies about this moment in history, and then it's fulfilled years later. So at first, Rome allowed its eastern conquests to a certain amount of self-government, but then they had constant uprisings and rivalries, and Rome was like, no, we're not dealing with this. So they reorganized the Mediterranean into provinces, and then they appointed governors from the Roman Senate to administer these provinces. So the province retained local freedom as long as they did not rebel. And their main obligation was to pay tribute or taxes in money or grain to Rome. And in return, Rome provided order and protection. So make sure you understand your 3 Punic Wars. First Punic War is the island of Sicily. Second Punic War is the surprise attack on Rome. And so it's the main cities get attacked, Rome and Carthage. Third Punic War, we see Carthage moving inland, Rome smashing it and calling it their new area Africa. So I know this is a longer video, but I'd like you to stay with me. So after our Punic Wars, we're going to briefly touch here on how the decline of the Roman Empire emerges and what dictatorship looks like. So by the first century BC, Rome was the greatest power in the Mediterranean world. But nevertheless, during the last 2 centuries before Christ, the very foundation of the Republic was shaken, and it wasn't by any foreign enemy, but by the problems that arose within the Republic herself, and all of the unintended consequences that came with that. So, the problems. The economic and military backbone of the early republic was the hard-working citizen farmer. And during the period of Roman expansion, the greatest military burden as well as economic hardship, fell on those small farmers. Many of them lost their land. When these citizen farmers returned from fighting Rome's wars, they were faced with numerous obstacles. Some of them lacked money and needed to get their land back in shape. Others were unable to pay the taxes and they lost their farms to the government. So it really like the basic unit that society operated on felt all of this disruption. And society changed. Those who were able to grow crops were unable to compete with the large farms that the wealthy aristocrats had or the cheap grain imported from the new Roman territories. So, in poverty and in debt, the small farmers sold their land, usually for a super cheap price, and sought jobs in the city. But jobs were hard to find because of the increased number of slaves that were brought into Italy following Rome's conquest. So now, the basic unit of society is landless and unemployed, and the citizen farmers became dissatisfied and restless, and their self-reliant spirit was broken down, and many turned to the government for help. But they received no help from the government. Since its early years, the Republic had undergone many changes in order to provide equal rights and privileges for all Roman citizens. The tribal assembly, which represented the common people, had greatly increased in power, but no sooner had these gains been achieved than the Punic Wars erupted. So the common people failed to assume the responsibilities they had struggled so long to gain, and they relied instead on the more experienced and stronger leadership of the Senate. So during the times of Roman conquest, the Senate was able to increase its power and again fully dominate the Republic. So the poor found champions for their cause in the brothers Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus. The Gracchi, so both of them, the Gracchi is kind of like the plural form, were from the noble families of Rome. Their father had been a consul, and guess who their grandfather was? Scipio. Remember, he led the Roman victory in the Second Punic War. This is his grandsons. The two brothers were elected to the tribune in 133 BC. Tiberius strove for reforms in the Republic and became the spokesperson for the common man. He proposed a change to Rome's land policy, and for years, wealthy aristocrats had monopolized the land gains through Roman conquest. Tiberius said, no, we need public lands to be divided among the poor. He also sought to limit the amount of public land controlled by any one person and kind of divide the wealth. And the tribal assembly adopted some of his reforms and proposals, but it also gained him very powerful enemies who disliked his reviving of the power of the tribal assembly versus the Senate. So when Tiberius sought re-election as a tribune, an act that was very contrary to Roman tradition at the time, angry senators killed him and 300 of his followers. The murderers then threw the bodies into the Tiber River. And so his brother is wrecked by this. So when Gaius became tribune in 123 BC, he sought to carry on his brother's legacy, the land reform measures. He also proposed that the government sell grain at lower prices to the poor, but the Senate undermined the popular support of Gaius by offering its own programs. But the Senate had no intention of carrying these reforms other than to just be an obstacle to him. So then, during some riots, they carefully planned to take the other Gracchus brother's life, Gaius. Now, so some accounts say that he committed suicide to keep from falling into the hands of senatorial forces. Others say he was killed by the Senate. Either way, once again, the Senate has prevailed. And this is going to lead to all sorts of riot and chaos. And we are getting into the civil wars. But I'm actually going to end our video there today. So I will have to make one more video that you will need to know and understand before our test next week, okay? So we'll have one more video and then we'll be all set. All right, guys, have a great day.